Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get to the clip where Larry Elder played my call debunking Black Lives Matter, let us review some more data. This is review, and we have to do it over and over again because divorcees like Sam Seder, who sits on his fat ass all day doing nothing, has a lot of free time. Nobody will ever defeat Stan on free time, and his ex-wife can likely attest to that. Sam Seder has important things to do on Twitter and YouTube. He's really important. Sam Seder has an autistic fit every time someone correctly mentions that Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter / George Floyd fiasco of 2020 started a very bad trend, or made one worse, as you'll see. Young black men especially were always suffering from a high murder death rate, usually at the hands of another young black male. Stan's not going to mention that because that's, although black men are slowly moving away from the Democrat Party, Stan's not going to mention that because that's his base. It has been this way for a century, but in 2020 and 2021 it accelerated as folks like Maxine Waters and the uneducated AOC tried to rile up their underemployed / unemployed base that has nothing to lose. They know in chess the pawns go first. They tried to rile up these losers, and it resulted in thousands and thousands of extra murders. Most of them were black. So yes, Black Lives Matter. You are responsible for thousands of extra murders the last couple years. And once the FBI comes out with the 2022 data, whoo, it's not getting any better. Let us look at the Nibber's data and find out what percentage of murder victims and offenders where we know the race of the victim or perp were black 2016 to 2019. There were 23,688 offenders and 56.5% of them were black. That is very disproportionate. Stand, the gun, we gotta have gun control and universal background checks, and that'll keep black people from killing black people. No, it won't. If a progressive lunch meat slicer takes issue with that, I will point out that 23,688 is a pretty good sample size of all murder offenders. Deal with it and or get an education at a parochial school so you can learn something aside from autistically reciting your pronouns. From 2016 to 2019, of the 21,695 victims where we know the race of the victim, 51.59% of them were black. That's also very disproportionate. From 2020 to 2021, the Nibber's data gives us 23,034 murder offenders where we know the race of the offender. Of those 23,034, 59.5% of them were black. That is also very disproportionate and a higher percentage than 2016 to 2019. Holy smokes. What a incredibly massive, eye-popping increase just in those 2 years. From 2020 to 2021, the Nibber's data gives us 24,584 victims of murder, and of those 24,584, 58.5% of them were black. So people can say, oh, blacks kill blacks and whites kill whites. That's a red herring. No, blacks kill blacks at a rate about 4.5 times the rate of whites. Their victimization rate is typically 8 times that of whites. It's been that way for about a century. It appears, see, I almost lost my spot. I mentioned just the murder rate per 100,000 was much, much higher in the latter time frame, 2020 and 2021, 6.8 per 100,000. Then in 2016 to 2019, that's 5.2 per 100,000. Yet, again, the percentage of murder victims and offenders that were black went up. So yes, Black Lives Matter. So Stan can have an autistic fit. And, ooh, you can't say that. Sorry, it's true, old man. It's as true as those divorce papers your wife handed you 6 years ago. You can play, go off in your little fantasy land and say it's not happening, but too bad. It appears that despite the whining of carnival barkers like the divorcee Sam Seder, Black Lives Matter accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. They created more chaos. That's the defund the police or thin their ranks, the Democrat insurrection that I've talked about. They created more chaos. They pine for fragmented families because they hate nuclear families. You remember when Black Lives Matter took an anti-nuclear family screed off their website September of 2020? Stan, you've got a fragmented family too. They actually hate nuclear families. They were excusing this behavior. Why do young black men abandon their children? At a rate much higher than Asians, Why is it? Why is it, Stan? Stan, why do Asian men have such a low homicide victimization rate and a homicide offender rate compared to young black males? Why is that, Stan? It's culture. So you can whine about guns all you want. It's culture. Let's look at some CDC data in a report, and I've got all this linked so you can go dig through it. It's kind of interesting. Very sobering. I'm sorry, Stan. Do you not like it if I use the word sobering? Now let's look at some CDC data in a report from way back in 1975. This is so long ago, even that old man Sam Seder was young. He may have had a real job back then. The homicide rate in these United States saw a huge spike in the 1910s and 20s and then dropped substantially in the 30s. During those roaring 20s, it was substantially higher than it has been over the last few years. During the 1950s, it was lower than it's been the last few years, just some food for thought. Some things have not changed. The upward trend for homicide victims from 1960 to 1974 is the primary focus of this report. The trend is kept in perspective by a comparison of recent homicide rates with the rates for earlier years. Some data concerning persons arrested for homicide and circumstances concerning the violent deaths supplied by the FBI are also presented. In 1973, 20,465 men, women, and children lost their lives from injuries inflicted by another person or persons with the intent to injure or kill. And I'm editing this while I do this, take out some info I don't need to go over. This figure gives a homicide rate of 9.8 deaths per 100,000 for 1973. Wow! The highest ever recorded for the nation. The next highest rate occurred more than 40 years ago, and keep in mind that was after the Civil Rights Act, and yet blacks were still killing blacks at an alarming rate. The next highest rate occurred more than 40 years ago in 1933, when the rate reached 9.7 per 100,000. So you just think about 6.8 is really bad, but it's been a lot worse. And Sam Seder didn't even know what an assault weapon was in 1973, or he hadn't parroted that loaded term, and he doesn't even know what it means, really. But he autistically repeats it now, but he didn't even know what it meant back then. I'm not sure he even knows what he means now. Provisional data for 1974 show that homicide is still at a high level. It is estimated that the rate for 1974 was at least 9.8 deaths per 100,000, with over 20,700 victims of homicide. The category white includes, in addition to persons reported as white, persons reported to be Mexican, or Puerto Rican. The categories races other than white and all other consist of persons reported as, this is the CDC's language, Negro, American Indian, Chinese, and Japanese, other numerically small racial groups, and persons of mixed race, mixed white, and other races. The Bureau of Census reports in 1973, I'm not going to read that, blah, 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 how many people were other than white. So, skipping to this, for each of the four color sex groups, the homicide rates declined slowly through the first half of the 1940s and through the 1950s, but the rates turned upward again at the beginning of the 1960s. And it started getting really bad in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. The upward trend continued through 1973 for three of the four color sex groups. That's white males, white females, and females of other races, but not for males of other races. For males other than white, the rate of increase in homicides decelerated from the middle of the 60s till about 71, then the rate turned downward from, listen to this, 70.1 homicides per 100,000 for 1972 to 65.8 homicides per 100,000 for 1973. Holy cow. Let me read that again. For males other than white, the rate of increase in homicides decelerated from the middle of the 60s until about 71, then the rate went down. 70.1 homicides per 100,000 in 72 and 65.8 in 1973. Wow, the effect on the total homicide rate of this striking downturn in the rate for males of other races, however, was more than offset by the accelerated rise in the rate for the white population. For white persons, the homicide rate rose from 4.9 deaths per 100,000 for 1972 to 5.5 for 1973, representing an increase of more than 1,000 deaths. Okay, so you can see how the massive differences in the homicide victimization rate for whites and males other than white. And then you start going through other data and you'll see it's black men killing black men most of the time. An examination of the mortality pattern for age-specific homicide rates for each year from 1933 to 1973. This is important. An examination of the mortality pattern for age-specific homicide rates for each year from 1933 to 1973 shows that, with few exceptions, for any given year for each of the 4 color sex groups, the age group 25 to 34, young black men, young men, the age group 25 to 34 had a considerably higher death rate than any other age group. This pattern holds up in periods where the homicide rates fell and in periods when the rates rose. Firearms, especially handguns, handguns are the primary means of homicide. According to information on the death certificates of the victims, the percentage of homicides committed by means of firearms and explosives rose from 54.7 in 1960 to 67.2 in 1973, an increase from 4,627 such homicides for 1960 to 13,572 for 1973. And in 1973, the FBI estimated that 53% of homicides were committed with handguns and about 14% with shotguns and other firearms. On the other hand, information on death certificates shows that the percentage of homicides committed with cutting and piercing instruments, especially knives, dropped from 21.7 in 1960 to 15.9 in 1973. The percentage decrease, however, does not reflect an actual decrease in the number of homicides committed with cutting and piercing instruments, because the number increased from 1,816 in 1960 to 3,254 in 1973. Rather, the decrease in the percentage is largely a result of a relatively greater increase during 1960 to 1973 in the use of handguns and other firearms and explosives to commit homicide. Other means of injury, including homicidal brawl, poisoning, drowning, and pushing from high places, accounted for about 20% of the homicides in 1960, but only for about 14.8% of such deaths in 1973. Again, the percentage decrease does not reflect an actual decrease in the number of homicides committed in these ways. The number increased from 1,700 in 1960 to 3,083 in 1973. Most of the decline in homicides among the non-white population occurred to non-white males. From 46 deaths, non-white males, from 46 deaths per 100,000 in 1950, their rate fell to 34 deaths per 100,000 in 1961, a decrease of 26% in 12 years. You see how staggeringly massive that is. The non-white populations, some things never change, do they? The level was still more than 7 times the national average. Over half of the homicides were by firearms and explosives. So the most violent segment of society is killing people with firearms and explosives back in the 50s and 60s. No surprise. Nearly 1/5 of the deaths of non-white males were classified in the residual category assault by other means, where the methods of homicides are not tabulated separately. Among the many titles included in this category are homicides from strangulations, fights, and assault by unspecified or other means which cannot be classified in those certain categories. Females and white persons had proportionally twice as many homicides in this category as males and non-white persons, respectively. Again, this entire transcript will be at Rumble. On the other hand, non-white persons showed almost twice as high a percentage of deaths from cuttings and stabbings as did white victims. In 1964, the rates for firearms and explosives and from cutting and stabbing wounds were greater for the non-white population than for the white, 8 and 16 times greater, respectively. Listen to that again. In 1964, the rates for firearms and explosives and from cutting and stabbing wounds were greater for the non-white population than the white. 8 and 16 times greater, respectively. For ages 25 to 44, these rates were 10 times greater for firearms and explosives and more than 20 times greater for cutting and stabbing wounds. So if Sam Seder's worried about deaths, it's young men, and specifically young black men most of the time, that you need to worry about. And they're not going to perform background checks. Stan Seder, to get his Marxist society, they have to disarm law-abiding people. And as long as law-abiding people are not disarmed, his Marxist society will not happen. So that's why he's not going to talk about it's fatherless young black males that don't care about gun laws that are doing the killing. And so-called mass shootings are a very small percentage. I've got data on that, if I remember right, from 2004 to 2018. About 13% of all homicides or murders were multiple victims. That's 2 or more for you Democrats listening. Since the 1930s, blacks, and particularly young black men, have always been disproportionately victims of murder, and most of the time they are the perpetrators as well. From 1980 to 2008, blacks were less than 13% of the population, yet were 52.5% of the offenders and 47.4% of the victims. So it's gotten worse in the last couple years. But in 1980 to 2008, it wasn't good. Do you see a trend? If Stan Seder is going to cry crocodile tears over dead bodies, he might want to go into the black community and tell them to plan their families instead of inseminating the first overweight Karen that gives him the time of day. Again, Stan, why are so few Asian kids born out of wedlock? Why is that? Tell them to stick around and raise Junior. Then again, Stan Seder has never had a successful relationship with the opposite gender of his species. So Stan giving marital advice would be like Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx giving advice on how to treat Jewish folks. Now for my call to Larry Elder, and then we'll move on.
Next call.
Hey, Larry, this is John from the frozen tundra of northern Iowa, and I wanted to commend you again. I found your show on Epic TV. I'm watching it regularly. Keep beating the drum. If a young black man is found murdered, it's likely he died at the hands of another young black man. And if you look at the homicide stats in the FBI, which I'm sure you have, from 2016 to 2019, the homicide rate went way up comparing to 2020 and 2021. And the percentage of blacks arrested and blacks being murdered went way up, which means the problem is getting even worse. So the George Floyd protests, it was a sham, and it made this country even worse. So keep beating that drum, Larry. Keep educating people. The most dangerous adversary to a young black male in America is another young black male, not the police or some Confederate flag waving redneck. Thanks, Larry. Love you. Bye.
Thank you. And regarding your being in the northern frozen tundra of Iowa, well, I may be joining you at some point if I decide to run for it, you know what. And of course, you're quite right about what you said about the stats regarding homicide. Half of all the homicides in this country are committed by and against other black people. A young black man is anywhere from 8 to 10 times more likely to be murdered than a young white man. And almost always the murderer of the young black man is, as the caller pointed out, another young black man. Why aren't we talking about this? The idea that somehow, as LeBron James said, after a black man was killed, Armin Arbery, the guy that was jogging in Georgia, he said black people are afraid to leave their homes. Afraid to leave their homes because a white person with a firearm is going to track them down and kill them. This is absolutely irresponsible. The George Floyd riots ended up killing a lot of people, destroying a lot of property. Why? Because of the assumption that what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd had to do with George Floyd's race. When in fact, as I said many times, the lead prosecutor, a black man, took pains in his opening statement to say the police in general were not on trial. The Minneapolis PD was not on trial. This individual named Derek Chauvin was on trial, and he never made an argument that Chauvin was motivated because of George Floyd's race, and Chauvin was never charged with a hate crime.
Thanks, Larry. I'm going to try to find my spot here. Sorry. Okay, now for some disturbing news from Chicago. Currently, the hood rats are rioting there in an effort to intimidate society into doing what they want. I wonder why Stan Seder... I wonder why there are not shootouts every single day in Iowa, although a few Democrat-dominated cities in Iowa are having some issues. But by and large, there are not shootouts all over Iowa, Maine, Lillywhite, Vermont, most of Lillywhite, Minnesota. Why is that, old man? Why is that? And why aren't Asians shooting each other in the hood? Why is that, Stan? You need to answer that in video. I've challenged Stan many times to debunk this, and he's run away from me. I told him, use your little internet show, because you're sitting on your fat ass. Use your little internet show to try to debunk me. And I'll respond in kind. It might take a while because I have a real job, okay? I'm not sitting on my fat ass reciting talking points all day like you. I have a real job. The divorcee Sam Seder wants you to think we are not safe anywhere, but that's a lie, and he even knows it because I told him. Chicago is a wreck, and Illinois has a very high homicide rate, but consider this data I unearthed long ago. Illinois' criminal homicide rate from 2018 to 2020 was 7.5 per 100,000. The FBI and the Illinois State Police data slightly differ. 7.5 per 100,000 from 2018 to 2020. That's pretty high. East St. Louis and Chicago criminal homicide rate from 2018 to 2020 was 23.391. Illinois homicide rate outside Chicago and East St. Louis from 2018 to 2020 was 3.105 per 100,000. Have we seen this movie before? So outside of St. Clair and Cook counties in Illinois, you're pretty safe. Let's find all the counties in Illinois that Donald Trump won with 60% of the vote or more in 2016 and 2020. He had to win 60% or more both times. I'm not going to name them all. They're too numerous. See the references. Unlike Sam Seder, I have references. I don't have Irma Vegetable repeating talking points in my ear. The counties in the land of Lincoln that voted twice for Donald Trump and 60% of the vote went to him both times or more. Cumulative homicides for those counties, 2018 to 2020, was a mere 76. And some people say, oh, there ain't nobody there. That's why. Well, that's why you adjust it per 100,000. There's a lot of small counties. You won't need many homicides before their homicide rate would go through the stratosphere. So it's called statistics, dummy. Now, the cumulative population of those counties, 2018 to 2020, was just short of 4 million. And the homicide rate in those counties that voted twice for Trump, 60% or more, their homicide rate 2018 to 2020 was 1.930 per 100,000. This is much lower than the Illinois total en masse and much lower than the homicide rate in Illinois outside of Chicago or East St. Louis. Again, the most violent areas of America tend to be diverse. Lots of fatherless children, lots of black-on-black homicide, lots of fragmented families. Right, Sam Seder? Fragmented families, lots of food stamps, and lots of kids dropping out of school. I doubt Woodford County, Illinois has fatherless children running down the main thoroughfare tossing Molotov cocktails through store windows. Chicago has that, but not the most GOP-entrenched counties in Illinois. The divorcee Sam Seder wants you to think the entire state of Illinois is a wreck, but it's mainly two counties, both overwhelmingly voting for Biden, Hillary, and any other person with a D after their name. It seems Chicago's new mayor, Brandon Johnson, wants to get rid of more police officers and replace them with social workers. This is an insane idea, but this is what the Democrat Party wants. They want to neuter the police, so there's no proactive policing in high crime areas, which will result in fewer criminals apprehended as the police are not anywhere in the neighborhood. I'll make a correction here. They want the police ranks thin so there are not enough of them to do their job. People like Kim Fox, want to let criminals loose, and if you defend yourself from BLM terrorists like Kyle Rittenhouse, they want to throw you in prison. They also want your guns, which is why Maxine Waters threatened Trump cabinet members, telling her unemployed base to make a crowd around them, intimidate them, and likely assault them. And that's why you remember Chuck Schumer, Kavanaugh, if you don't stop these bad decisions, you don't know what hit you. And then, wow, somebody showed up at Kavanaugh's house with guns. You tell me. They are the most violent people in America. This is their vision for society. So the next time the BLM hood rats riot, nobody can stop them. And if you don't vote the way they want you, they want you to, can't even talk, they will burn your town down or attempt to burn it down, which has happened often over the past few years in the Twin Cities, Seattle, Portland, Chicago, and Baltimore. This doesn't happen in Western Iowa. I wonder why. Sam Seder, why do you think these riots don't happen in Western Iowa? Why not? And if they tried it, what do you think would happen? Now for some comments on Chicago's newest mayor, a man who likely has a lot of security but does not have the same sentiment towards regular folks in Chicago, which is likely why Illinois and Chicago are hemorrhaging population. Of Illinois' 102 counties, 64 of them, or 62.74%, had 0 homicides in 2016. An additional 17 counties had 1 homicide. The violence is not everywhere, just places where Democrats rule. 64 of Illinois' 102 counties had 0 homicides in 2020. They had 11.41%, almost 1.5 million of the state's population. 56 of Illinois' 102 counties, or 54.9%, had 0 homicides in 2019. So again, the most violent places in America are diverse, allowed lots of black-on-black homicide like Chicago, and they vote Democrat. If you find a young black male dead in Chicago, he was more than likely killed by another young black male. So here's some sobering information for you. If you live in Chicago and you're not a Democrat, I urge you, if you can, get the hell out of there, please.
All right. He doesn't want to tell the kids what's on the tests. He doesn't want to give them much homework. He doesn't want to give Fs. Now he's the mayor. Like, how could that translate? How could this sort of equity in education translate into policy? Well, he's also not really into policing. He's sort of down with rioting, looting, things of that nature. Here he is in 2020.
There was rioting and organized looting last night, and you're calling to defund the police. Explain that.
Yeah, what we're seeing is obviously an outbreak of incredible frustration and anguish that communities that have been isolated through poverty over generations. And what we have is sort of a typical, very standard, quite frankly, a very tired response to the regularly scheduled pandemic, which is structural racism. And that response has been to increase police presence that has not led to anything of substance to secure communities and to make communities whole.
Such nonsense. Do you know study after study has proven that when you send more policing into these areas, these high crime areas, that crime goes down? And when you take policing out and you defund the police, people then are upset because next thing you know, oh, grandma got shot. Could somebody? Oh, there's nobody around because we defunded the police.
The basic issues further left wing than even Lori Lightfoot was. And Lori Lightfoot probably was the worst mayor in the entire city. And I think she got, 17, or entire country, 17%, if I remember correctly, of Chicago voters picked her in the primary. And then there was a runoff. 2 guys were very close, Vallis and Johnson. Vallis said, hey, we need to support police. We need to give them our backing as political leaders. Brandon Johnson had been in favor of defunding the police. And now he's even saying, and I can't believe this is real, social workers, counselors, EMTs, they need to be at crime scenes, not more police. Listen to this. This is Chicago's new mayor.
One of the things that I think is actually quite fascinating about our position here in Chicago, we've been pushing this ordinance called treatment, not trauma. In essence, first responders, social workers, counselors, EMT, these individuals would show up to cause that require those type of interventions. In fact, in Chicago, almost 40% of the 911 calls are mental health crises. We're asking police officers to do their job and someone else's. Like, that's not strategic. In fact, 60% of the violence that happens in the city of Chicago, it occurs in 6% of the city.
Okay,
and
so
unfortunately, that 6% of the city largely decided that they were going to support this candidate for mayor, now soon to be mayor. Has he been sworn in? I forget when this.
I don't think he's been sworn in yet, but yeah.
Which is just going to result in a whole lot more shootings and violence and bloodshed in Chicago than would have been the case if you had had a true law and order mayor in place. I mean, I'll just point out, Clay, this idea that we just want mental health workers to show up for, I just had the experience last week, which I talked about on the show, of a guy who was, just masturbating in front of women on the subway at 9 a.m. in a crowded New York City subway area, right? And no one does anything, no one says anything, cops aren't there, nobody cares. And you say to yourself, well, who's supposed to deal with that? Do they really think that a mental health or social worker wants to deal with that? Somebody who is doing something like that, somebody who is having the police called because they're emotionally disturbed, is a danger to people. That doesn't mean they are necessarily going to do anything that is violent, but they've already broken the law and people are scared. And people who break the law and make people scared are much more likely than just someone walking down the street to do something awful to you. The cops are there because they have tasers and batons and, if necessary, a sidearm, and they have restraints, and they have. That's the whole point, right? You don't want to send a sociologist to do a cop's job. The sociologist doesn't want to do the job, Clay. That's the point. They don't want to get sent.
I mean, yeah, how many social workers out there want to be on call at 2:30 and have to go into violent neighborhoods? And this is, to me, a sign of how woefully lacking in knowledge the new Chicago mayor is, because any police officer out there listening to us right now knows that you have no idea which of the calls that you are going to go on are going to explode in violence. Most people don't call the police because everything is perfect. They're going to violent, dangerous situations. So this was the argument that defund the police people made. I mean, this is just defund the police by another phrasing. He's saying, hey, I want there to be more social workers, counselors showing up at crime scenes. That is a recipe for disaster. And frankly, it puts those social workers' lives in danger.
Hey, Sam Seder, you still with me, old man? All right. Yeah, Dave Rubin's not going to debate you. He's married. He's got kids. Well, his kids live under the same roof as him. Yours don't, Stan. So Dave Rubin doesn't have any time for you. Tucker Carlson doesn't have any time. In fact, Tucker Carlson doesn't even know who you are. So instead, you get me, old man, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, what are you going to do about it? Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Clay and Buck. Very important admission by Chicago's newest mayor, and we will touch on that again. Most of the violence in the very violent city of Chicago is in a handful of neighborhoods, not across the entire city, and most of it is black people killing and assaulting black people in mostly black neighborhoods, ding, full of children that never met daddy. So when Stan's talking about, ooh, the guns, we got to do that. No, Stan. No, old man. Most of Montana is perfectly safe. Most of Iowa, most of Wisconsin, most of Minnesota, most of Texas, all of Maine, all of Vermont, most of Virginia. Well, there's a handful of cities in Virginia that are getting. Most of Idaho is perfectly safe. Most of Washington State's perfectly safe. So, yeah, you need to do some reading, Stan. I can see why you went and got a religion degree from a diploma mill. You're not very bright, buddy. So, some more information debunking the notion that the entire U.S. is having a murder epidemic. Most of Lily White, Montana, as I mentioned, is uber safe, as is most of Lily White, Iowa. Some months ago, I did a series of videos debunking a couple of divorcees entitled Divorcees Stan Seder, and Old Fart Rants Are Suddenly Concerned About Dead People in Buffalo, parts 1 through 5. I've got those up on YouTube, and Rumble. Much of the information in those videos focuses on the percentage of arrestees and murder victims in a given state using state police data that were black. Some of the numbers are eye-popping, but I also had a boatload of data on arrests. In many jurisdictions, as the murder rate went up and the violent crime rate went up, or stayed at roughly the same rate, in many of those states, the number of arrests for violent crime, I'm going to correct that while I'm writing this out. Sorry. I'll keep that in there too. In many of those states, the number of arrests for murder and violent crime plummeted. This illustrates the Ferguson effect. Regressive, mentally ill, bipolar Democrats intimidated the police or thinned their numbers so much that criminals were emboldened because they were far less likely to get caught, which is just what folks like George Soros, Rachel Rollins, and Kim Fox want. Does the following surprise you? We've done this before, but we need to do it again in detail to thwart folks like the divorcee Sam Seder, who has gobs of free time to sit on his fat ass all day on social media reciting talking points. In 2020, 72.41%, or 63 of 87, of Minnesota's counties had zero murders, and they were over 25% of the state population. In 2021, 59 of Minnesota's 87 counties, or 67.81%, of their counties had no homicides, and most of those counties were won by Donald Trump with more than 60% of the vote. Of Minnesota's 87 counties, 62 of them had zero homicides in 2016. An additional 14 counties had one homicide. So when you go across the U.S., if you throw out counties with no homicides and one homicide, you get down to about, it's roughly a third of the U.S. And then a small portion of those counties. So it's just the vast majority of homicide in the U.S. happens in the most violent 10% of counties. That's the vast majority of it. But Stan wants you to think, it's everywhere. No, stupid. It's not. Pull your head out of your ass, all right, dummy? Counties in Minnesota that voted for Donald Trump 60% or more of the vote both in 2016 and 2020. Those counties from 2018 to 2020, keep up with me, Stan. I'm talking fast, you'll have to listen fast. Those counties from 2018 to 2020 had a murder rate of 0.98 per 100,000, a far cry from what is happening in the Twin Cities, which is a Democrat enclave, and a far cry below the Minnesota state average. From 2018 to 2020, the FBI and Minnesota's Department of Public Safety, their data was pretty close. FBI said Minnesota had a homicide rate of 2.435 per 100,000. The criminal homicide rate for Minneapolis and St. Paul in 2018 to 2020 was 10.984 per 100,000. And the criminal homicide rate from 2018 to 2020 in Minnesota outside the Twin Cities was 1.152 per 100,000. Again, homicide is not increasing everywhere. It is mainly cities run by Democrats that have catered to the Black Lives Matter sociopaths, cities that have woke public schools. We can't read except our beer can label, and we know our pronouns, and we're not gonna, but we can slice the lunch meat. Lots of folks, those cities have woke public schools, lots of people on food stamps, lots of fatherless children, and they are usually diverse areas too. In a given year, 2/3 to 3/4 of Iowa's counties have 0 murders, and there are a handful of cities that are responsible for most of it. Council Bluffs, Iowa City, and Ames are 3 cities that have low murder rates, maybe a little high for Iowa, but comparing them to the national rate, they're low. Council Bluffs, Iowa City, and Ames, but when you combine those with Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Fort Dodge, Waterloo, and Davenport, some areas, those cities do have very high homicide rates. That's where the vast majority of murders in Iowa occur. It's not spread out everywhere as uneducated, mentally deficient folks like Sam Seder want you to think it is. Of the counties in Wisconsin that voted 60% or more for Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020, those counties had a murder rate from 2018 to 2020 of 1.473 per 100,000. The problem area in Wisconsin is Milwaukee County and primarily Milwaukee City, which has, you guessed it, a lot of black-on-black murder. Outside that county, not so much. 32 of Wisconsin's 72 counties had 0 murders in 2021, and they were over 17% of the state population. Of Wisconsin's 72 counties, 48 of them had 0 homicides in 2017. An additional 13 counties had 1 homicide. So the vast majority of Wisconsin's counties in any given year have 1 homicide or 0. So if anybody says, oh, we're not safe everywhere, homicides up there everywhere. No, dumbass, no. So if the divorcee Sam Seder is really worried about dead folks, he needs to quit doing Google research and actually learn something. Find out where the vast majority of this murder is occurring and who is doing it. But if he admits that, his whole narrative collapses. Cognitive dissonance. It's wondering if there's a link between cognitive dissonance and bipolar. I have news for the mentally ill idiot. It's usually cities that have lots of young black males who grow up sans daddy and never finished high school, murdering other young black males who had no father and failed to finish high school in cities that are dominated by the Democrat Party. I will close with this, and I intend to do a sequel to the video on your screen very soon. It illustrates in great detail the threats that progressive Democrats have made and will stalemate any video Sam Seder uploads that purports to show Republicans wanting to get violent using that as a vote Democrat argument. Now that the divorcee has been stalemated, we will debate why the most violent cities in America have lots of black-on-black murder and vote Democrat. Even a lot of so-called red states, you remember Reagan's Sea of Blue in '84, even a lot of so-called red states like Tennessee and Missouri have high murder rates, but it boils down to a handful of counties. Just like Chicago's mayor said, it's a handful of neighborhoods in Chicago. It's not the whole thing. It boils down to a handful of counties in those states, and those counties lean Democrat. They have lots of blacks killing blacks. Memphis, the armpit of America, is a perfect example of that. So we're going to close with this. And when you vote the next November, boy, you people, if you can get out of Massachusetts, if you can get out of California, get out of Illinois, get to Florida, Texas, come to Iowa if you're sane. Get out of those places so the next census we can have a bigger shift. But this is what these lunatics want. And Sam Seder will never admit the truth. I've already accepted his concession, but we're going to keep hammering him because he has a lot of free time. and he's never going to let up, but neither are we. So as soon as he admits the truth, then his entire narrative collapses. Maybe he'd have a road to Damascus conversion. It might be like getting the Windows, screen of death, or he might lock up, not know what to do once he finds out it's the truth. But he lies a lot. Sam Seder had lied to himself a lot while he was married. He's lied to himself a lot after that, and he's continuing to lie to himself. Now, I'm just over this. He knows where the homicide's occurring. He knows why it's occurring. He knows who's doing it, and he knows who the victims are. But will he ever have the guts to admit it?
Now, this man back in 2005 offered his own prescription to deal with the racism that has triggered her and caused her to have a microaggression. He was serious too. Note the clapping. This was in 2005. His name is Kamal Kaban, and he taught Africana Studies at North Carolina State University. Watch this.
And the one idea is how we are going to exterminate white people, because that, in my estimation, is the only conclusion I have come to.
How are we going to exterminate white people? It's the only conclusion I've come to?
We have to exterminate white people off of the face of the planet to solve this problem.
All white people? Every single one of them? There are no good ones?
Now, I don't care whether you clap or not, but I'm saying to you that we need to solve this problem because they are going to kill us. And I will leave on that. So we have to just set up our own system and stop playing and get very serious and not be diverted.
They are going to kill us. Now, that was in 2005. I wonder if this man is still alive. I'm black and I'm still here.